refer to, and the genetic editions where we know how Beckett went on to compose Endgame and the process of composition, what he included initially, what he excluded as he went on. So I'll try and be, of course, we cannot possibly exhaust even 5% of this complex text in 1 hour. So I'll see what I can do. But of course, we could come back to any of these things during the Q&A, and I'm happy to take questions. So Devadito requested me to summarize some of the central points in Bengali. I'll try and do that. It's not going to be very easy because these are complex thoughts and ideas, and sometimes they require a certain kind of academic language which may or may not exist in Bangla, at least the way we do it, the way we conduct discourse there. Devadito, did you want to say something?
Yes. I'm sorry, actually, there was almost a surge of people trying to join, so I skipped that part. Thank you for reminding. I request everyone here, I assume that there are people joining outside West Bengal. So I will just offer a note of apology to all of you, but I have insisted, not requested, actually I insisted that Orkoda summarizes certain important portions and important arguments about this text, primarily because our students here belong to rural Bengal, though they are trying their level best to formally tackle the language as a student of English literature as well as language, but I thought that it will be a little difficult for them to, unless certain points are re-emphasized in Bangla. So whatever Orkotha is going to say in this regard is due to our request only, so please bear with us.
No problem. Thank you. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll speak primarily in English, but after I complete a certain strand of thought, let's say, I'll try and give a very brief gist in Bangla. That's what I would try. And as I said, it's not going to be easy because of the kind of critical language we have in English and Bangla are very, very different. And I'm clearly trained in one and not so trained in the other. Nevertheless, let's start talking about Endgame. So Samuel Berkeley Beckett was born in 1906. This is a play he wrote after Waiting for Godot. It's not his second play, though. I mean, before Waiting for Godot, much earlier, he wrote a play called Eleutheria, which you are interested, if you're interested, you're welcome to read. It has a character named Krapp, Victor Krapp. The name comes back in a much more famous Beckett play later on, Krapp's Last Tape. So Endgame, almost like most of the things Beckett ever wrote, was written in French first, like Waiting for Godot, Onatondo Godot, and then he translated his text into English. Beckett is quite a unique case of self-translation. There are very few writers globally till date who have translated almost everything that they themselves have written from one language to another. And there's a lot of discussion these days. In fact, Beckett is almost an inevitable name whenever anyone talks about self-translation. Even in very unconventional places, like most recently, I was quite surprised to see Jhumpa Lahiri refer to Beckett in a long and beautiful text she wrote on self-translation. She recently translated one of her Italian books into English. Nevertheless, so this aspect of self-translation is important because most of the Beckett texts are that way twice born. Because as we know, self-translation is a kind of a new creation. It's not necessarily a very, straightforward translation. If I'm the writer as well as the translator of the work, I would perhaps try and recreate the work. It's almost an inevitable temptation to recreate my own story or, play or anything else in another language. So let's keep this point in mind because the way Beckett started writing in French that French was a very difficult language in the sense that it wasn't his mother tongue. It was not a language that came to him very naturally. He said that. In fact, he said he wanted to write without style, which is why he chose French. There were many other reasons. Of course, he had migrated to France. He was not very happy with the literary censorship culture in Dublin. He was also quite unhappy with the kind of hyper-nationalist project in Dublin. So there were political as well as creative reasons why he wanted to move to Paris, and Paris was considered this liberated zone for writers back in the day. And his master, James Joyce, someone he considered one of his literary heroes, was in Paris. So there were many reasons why he would move to the legendary Left Bank in Paris, where all these émigrés or expatriate writers lived, writers who had come in from other countries. For example, someone like Ionesco from Romania had migrated to France. So again, Beckett started writing in French and started translating his French texts into English. This was not a practice that he had early on. Like Murphy was written first in English and then translated into French. There are these chronological things. For example, even in the later works, some of the later works, very few though, are also written first in English and then translated into French. But most of his works are written first in French and then translated into English. And as quite famously argued by Salman Rushdie in his beautiful introduction to the Grove Centennial edition of Beckett's works, that his French also changed his English in a very significant way. So if you are familiar with Irish literature and also the kind of Hiberno English Irish writers often write, you would understand the implication of what Beckett meant when he said, I want to write without style. Because Irish writers have this very strong tendency to write in a very flowery English, even today, when English language has largely simplified across the globe. And the language of literature has also quite radically simplified, sometimes to a dismay. But nevertheless, I'm not going to go into that. In 1958, Beckett's Endgame was first staged and published the same year. I'm just beginning with some contextual details here. He dedicated this play to the famous French director, Roger Blanc, B-L-I-N, R-O-G-E-R, B-L-I-N, Roger Blanc. Roger Blanc was a great French director who had already directed Waiting for Godot, and Beckett was very good friends with him, and he dedicated this play to Roger Blanc. Okay. He wrote it as Fin de Partie in French in late 1957, early 1958, and he translated it as Endgame. Now, this was written after the trilogy of novels, the famous trilogy of novels by Beckett, Molloy, Malone Dies, The Unnameable. Again, all three written into English from French, translated into English from French by the author himself. Endgame is not, of course, a sequel to Waiting for Godot. Let us begin with a very curious remark Beckett made in one of his letters to his American director. I mean, the guy who directed most of the Beckett plays at that point in America was Alan Schneider. And Beckett wrote in a letter to Alan Schneider that this is a play that is far more inhuman, that's the term he used, far more inhuman than Waiting for Godot. We might see why as we go on. And he also made a very interesting comment about the way this play depends on the power of the text to claw. This is the expression he used, the power of the text to claw. He said it's a difficult play to stage because it's a play that almost entirely depends on the power of the text to claw. So I would like to underline this clawing function of the text, quite literally, the clawing function of the text, the disturbing, inhuman function of the text. Okay, again, we might come back to this later on, but let me also take this opportunity to highlight that Beckett's theatre is a very strongly text-driven theatre. What do I mean by that? So, for example, in a typical, Broadway production, it's quite, usual when a character is reminiscing and going into a long speech that suddenly we will have a visualization of that memory. So someone is remembering something and we will have a sudden visualization of that. Maybe two other characters will come in, will play out that memory. That's a visualization of the text. This is something we almost never have in Beckett. There's a very strong appeal to this clawing power of the text. So the text will present itself in the form of speech, and it will be left for the audience to visualize it. This is a movement that is intrinsically anti-theatrical, if you think of it like that. Because the very typical idea of theater, unlike a novel, is that it will give you an image. It will visualize things for you. Cinema and theater, these are forms that visualize language. They do not just present us with the chunk of language we read in a page of a novel. অর্থাৎ একটু ছোট করে বাংলায় বলি, বেকেটের আত্ম অনুবাদের কথা বলছিলাম। আত্ম অনুবাদের মধ্যে দিয়ে কিভাবে উনি কার্যত নতুন লেখা তৈরি করতেন, প্রত্যেকটা লেখার একটা পুনর্জন্ম হতো আত্ম অনুবাদের মধ্যে দিয়ে ফ্রেঞ্চ থেকে ইংরেজিতে, সেটা একটা বিষয়। আরেকটা বিষয় হলো দৃশ্যায়নকে একভাবে বিরোধিতা করা। যে কোনো ক্ষেত্রেই নাটকের এই যে দৃশ্যমগ্ন একটা ব্যাপার আছে, দৃশ্য কেন্দ্রিকতা, সেটাকে বেকেট একভাবে সবসময় বিনির্মাণ করার চেষ্টা করছেন। কারণ বেকেট কিন্তু ট্রেডিশনালি স্পিকিং রিয়েলিস্ট নাট্যকার নন, এবং রিয়েলিজমকে, থিয়েটারে যেটাকে রিয়েলিজম বলা হয়, সেটাকে বারবার নানাভাবে উনি ভাঙার চেষ্টা করেছেন। এবং তার একটা গুরুত্বপূর্ণ দিক হলো কোন একটা দীর্ঘ মনোলগ বা যে কোনো একটা দীর্ঘ মেমোরি স্পিচ যদি হয়, বেকেটের ক্ষেত্রে, ওনার নাটকের ক্ষেত্রে খুব কম দেখা যায় যে সেই টেক্সটটা ভিজুয়ালাইজড হচ্ছে। অর্থাৎ এই ভিজুয়ালাইজেশনটা রিডারকে বা অডিয়েন্সকে করতে বলা হচ্ছে, ইনভাইট করা হচ্ছে, কিন্তু এটা করে দেওয়া হচ্ছে না। ইটস নট ডান অন দেয়ার বিহাফ অন স্টেজ। ওকে, লেটস কিপ দিস ইন মাইন্ড। নাও, as I said, this play was initially, so no, I didn't say this, so not as I said, but this play was initially written as a 2-act play, and then he compressed it to a 1-acter. Now, Beckett often had this technique of composition. If we go through his notebooks, his compositional material, we will see that he often began with very concrete details in his plays, and then slowly he clipped them out. He clipped them away. In fact, in one of the drafts of another play, a different play, he called this process veganing. Vague mane asposhto, vegan kora mane asposhto kore tola. Veganing. This is a word he invented. He's a Joycean at some level, so there's always invention of words in Beckett. Nevertheless, so this veganing process is something interesting for Endgame, because when this play started, he imagined this to be a dialogue between two people who are admitted in a hospital, and this is a hospital where two patients are talking. There's been a bombardment during the First World War, and because of the bombardment, these people have lost body parts, they have been, rendered incapacitated, and they are in a hospital, they're admitted to a hospital, and they're talking to one another. So that was the original context. And it reminds us of Beckett's own work during the war. He decided to leave France. He decided to leave Ireland for France. In fact, he famously said, I choose to be in Ireland at war rather than, France at war rather than Ireland in peace. Now, he did some work for the Irish Red Cross, and he worked in this bombarded hospital called St. Clove. There are sort of glimpses of that in the first draft of Endgame. So the context was much more specific, historical. But as we know, by the time we come to the final draft, the text that we read, it's all vague. It's vaganed. It's bare interior. It's the gray light in the bare interior. we do not know where this play is set. And this is very typical of Beckett. It's a signature trait. I'm hoping and guessing most of you would have read the text through once. So you know, again, if you go back to Waiting for Godot, it begins with that famous articulation, country road evening. Okay, so country road, we don't know which country road, we don't know where. There is no specific geographical location. And this is very typical of Waiting for Godot and Beckett's entire theatrical oeuvre. In fact, even in his fiction, he would rarely set his novels with a realistic setting. So let's keep that in mind. But this, the connection with the World War and the connection with the bomb is something that haunts this play. You know, it's like that famous story, Edgar Allan Poe's Purloined Letter, where the contents of the letter are not there, and yet we speculate about it throughout. Similarly, this is a play about the atom bomb, as someone like Theodor Adorno would argue. So Adorno is the famous Frankfurt School philosopher who was a friend of Beckett's, and he was a great admirer of Beckett's. He presented a talk on Endgame, and it was called Trying to Understand Endgame. This is a text that I would strongly recommend you all to read. Trying to Understand Endgame was written in 1957-58. It's widely available online as well. This is a very important text because Adorno has a very different reading of Beckett. At this point, after Waiting for Godot, Beckett was clubbed together with the existentialists. And till date, you know, the curriculum insists that he's an absurdist playwright. This is an idea I would like to complicate for sure. I mean, this term is a complete misnomer when it comes to Beckett and, in fact, many of the other writers who were clubbed together in Martin Eslin's famous book. There's nothing absurd about any of these writers, and least of all Beckett. Nevertheless, it's a critical term which was coined by Martin Esslin, and of course he had a certain aesthetic logic for coining this term. He saw these playwrights and this kind of theatre in a line with Sartre's and Camus' existentialism, absurdism, but it was a critical interpretation. There was no movement called the theatre of the absurd, and it's just one of those slightly reductive labels. In fact, if we see Beckett studies as a field, this term is almost banned out of Beckett studies. You know, if you use the word absurd, writing about Beckett as a serious scholar in the field, you will not be taken seriously, unfortunately, unless you really revolutionize the term and do something magnificent with it. Nevertheless, I will not necessarily come back to this point, but I think it's an important point because Adorno, for example, reads Endgame as a critique of the war, as a critique of the atom bomb political culture. And in fact, he makes this point very clearly, and that's why I mentioned Purloined Letter, which some of you might be familiar with. He says that Beckett's play is about the atom bomb precisely because it is not a play that mentions the atom bomb. So this omission becomes a structural principle. You know, there was a certain strand of criticism that at that point especially would consider Beckett to be an apolitical writer, অরাজনৈতিক লেখক ভাবা হতো। কিন্তু অরাজনৈতিক হওয়ার প্রশ্ন উঠছে না এখানে। যে পয়েন্টটা খুব চমৎকারভাবে ড্রাইভ হোম করেন অ্যাডর্নো, সেটা হলো এই যে হলোটা রয়েছে, the hollow of representational content. What is the hollow? You know, famously, Godot is the hollow in Waiting for Godot, the figure who never arrives. It's a structural hole, as it were, in the text. Similarly, Endgame ঠিক কি হচ্ছে বা কি কনটেক্সটে লেখা হয়েছে এই নাটকটা পড়তে আমরা সেইটা বুঝতেই সব থেকে বেশি স্ট্রাগল করি। There's a hollowing out of the very central representational content of the play. And that, for Adorno, is a political principle. It is precisely what makes Beckett's works political rather than making it apolitical. অর্থাৎ সামাজিক রাজনৈতিক জগৎ থেকে যে একটা দূরত্ব তৈরি হচ্ছে বেকেটের লেখাতে, এই দূরত্বায়নটা, এই ডিস্টেন্সিংটা নন পলিটিক্যাল নয়। ইনফ্যাক্ট এই ডিস্টেন্সিংটাই পলিটিক্যাল ইন বেকেট। This was the famous point Adorno made, but Adorno also criticized this existentialist appropriation of Beckett. In fact, he said, and he's very right on this point, Beckett is a writer who, in fact, pastiches or satirizes this existentialist culture. And anyone who has read the Unnameable, which was written before Endgame, the novel Unnameable. In that novel, we have that little section where he talks about balls with your being and existing and all of that. So he was, and in Molloy as well, there is a backhanded reference to Sisyphus. So Beckett was very aware of the fact that whatever he was writing was somehow mistaken to be in that particular tradition of the absurd. And he would resist that to a large extent. Nevertheless, this idea that, and in fact, Adorno's piece begins with this very famous remark that if there is any absurdity in Beckett, it's in the method. It's in the method of composition. For example, the way he writes out the contextual material. The World War context is written out of the play. The atom bomb context is written out of the play. And this produces a structural hollowing, which in itself is political. I also wanted to mention, some of the inspirations. If we go back to the notebooks, we get this very clear. If World War is one reference point for Beckett, and as I said, these references are there in the earliest versions, which are then clipped away. The other very important reference point is the Bible, and especially the book of Genesis. So we have these figures, right, in the play. What are the character names? And Beckett came up with these names much later. This is again typically Beckettian. He would begin with alphabet names of characters, A, B, C, D, and then right at the end of the composition, he would come up with the character names. So Ham, Clove, Nell, Nag, these are the 4 characters. And there's one structural principle here that is noted by Gontarski and Doug Van Hol and other manuscript scholars of Beckett, theatrical notebook editors of Beckett, that there's a principle in this naming. It goes back to the different names of Noah's sons, going back to the book of Genesis. And in that way, we can consider the entire stage to be a kind of Noah's Ark. So it's a sort of post-apocalyptic setting where the world has come to an end, as it were, and we have this bare interior, as Ham and Clove and others keep saying, outside of here, it's death. This is a line that keeps getting repeated, and Ham says it most of the times. Outside of here is death. And we have this sort of Noah's Ark-like situation, where this is perhaps the only place where there's some minimal existence of life after the great punitive floods. And, this is from where the humanity as a species may or may not survive. This is the whole question of Noah's Ark. So the story of Genesis was again a very important reference point for Beckett. There were many more references to Bible in the first drafts of Endgame, which were then clipped away. I also wanted to mention the Shakespearean intertexts. Our revels now have ended. That's a line from Tempest, which Beckett uses in this play. There are also references to King Lear, again, mostly hidden out references, not very clear at all. But Lear was a very important intertext. Almost all his life, Beckett was very fond of this play, especially Edgar, the character Edgar in Lear. Not a very prominent character, but that particular sentence of Edgar, or that line of Edgar's where he says, it is not the worst as long as you can say this is the worst. This became a kind of, inspirational sentence or line for Beckett when he composed one of his last great texts, Worst Word Ho. Nevertheless, what's the connection with King Lear here? In a way, of course, the name Ham suggests Hamlet. That's one Shakespearean echo there. But another structural principle that is noted quite clearly by Gontarski and others in the notebook editions is that, it's like we have the 3, we have a hammer. Ham is also a hammer. And Clove, Nell, Nag, these 3 are, as it were, 3 screws. So we have this very interesting sort of a metaphor of carpentry, as it were. So we have a hammer and the 3 screws that are supposed to be nailed. But then this brings back the Christian imagery, the imagery of the cross. And again, this is quite strongly present in both Waiting for Godot and Endgame. Let me clarify one point. I don't think these are religious plays. এগুলো ধর্মীয় নাটক নয়, একেবারেই ধর্মীয় নাটক নয়। কিন্তু যেটা বেকেট নিজেও বলেছিলেন বেশ কয়েকবার, যে উনি ক্রিশ্চিয়ানিটিকে একটা মিথোলজি হিসেবে ইউজ করেন, একটা মিথোলজিক্যাল রেফারেন্স পয়েন্ট, একটা ট্রেজার ট্রোভ অফ স্টোরিজ, হ্যাঁ, অজস্র গল্পের আখ্যানের একটা স্রোত হিসেবে ব্যবহার করেন। এবং আমার মনে হয় সেটাই ভাবা ভালো। ইটস নট আ রিলিজিয়াস প্লে, because there's nothing sacred in Beckett. In fact, there's a certain working through of the sacred, but there's always a challenge to the sacred in Beckett's work. But nevertheless, the biblical mythology is very strongly present. রূপকথার মতো করে, সেই জন্যই বাইবেল জেনেসিসের কথা বলি। The other detail about the name Clove, which is important, is that it evokes the word division. Clove comes from cleave. The word cleave means division, to divide something. And in a lot of Beckett plays, not just in Endgame, we have what Beckett himself called these pseudocouples. This is the expression he uses, pseudocouples. Ham and Clove, Nell and Nag, Didi and Gogo in Waiting for Godot, Mercier and Camille in a fictional work. There are many examples of these primarily male pseudocouples. It's actually difficult to say whether Nell and Nag would qualify as pseudocouples, because the notion of the pseudocouple is quite homosocial, if not homoerotic, in Beckett's works. So the principle of a pseudocouple, I think, also needs to be remembered in this case. And the idea of division is important, because at some level we are talking about, a very Hegelian division of self-consciousness into two different consciousnesses. This is the famous Hegelian idea of, the war of consciousness that creates the master and the slave. The master and the slave are two parts of the same consciousness at war with each other. And we see a master-slave relation like this famously again in Waiting for Godot, in Pozzo and Lucky. And somehow Beckett seems to recreate that arc. We don't have a Didi and Gogo in Endgame. What we have is Ham and Clove recreating that master-slave dynamic of Lucky and Pozzo, as it were, with a continuity between Pozzo and Ham, and again a continuity between Lucky and Clove. Now, to continue a little bit further, and further with the theatre history of the Shakespeare connection. So Peterbrooke, the famous theatre director, Peterbrooke, in 1962 made again a very well-known production of King Lear, which was infested with Endgame. So he did not direct Endgame, right? He directed King Lear, and there's a famous scene in King Lear when the blinded Gloucester is trying to escape. And Edgar, who's this Bedlam beggar, he's in the disguise of a beggar, and he's trying to lead the way to Edgar. And this is famously called the Dover Cliff scene. This Dover Cliff scene, where there is no cliff, in fact, and there's a certain attempted suicide of Gloucester's, after which he decides not to quit life and continue with it. This scene was done like Endgame. So this was Peterbrooke's genius. He saw in this scene a particular Beckettian echo. And this is 1962. Endgame is a great theatrical success, and everybody's talking about Beckett. So he decided to do Shakespeare in a Beckettian way, not Beckett in a Shakespearean way, right? So this is a famous instance of this. If you're more interested, again, there's a famous book by Jan Kott, which is about various theatrical adaptations of Shakespeare, and there's a particular chapter on Beckett and Shakespeare, if you're interested in that. Shakespeare, Our Contemporary, I think, if I'm speaking from memory, but that's possibly the title of the book. Nevertheless, and since that point, other directors, very recently, up till 2007, 2006-7, have continued to do Lear, King Lear, in a sort of Endgame-like way. So let's keep that in mind. The other structural principle that I think we should keep in mind, when we are talking about Endgame is the principle of chess. At some level, these characters, the four characters, the parents in the ash cans, the trash bin parents, I'll perhaps come back to that point, and the two main figures, Ham and Clove, they are like pawns. They are like little, pawns on a chessboard. Beckett was very fascinated with the game of chess. We have a famous representation of that in Murphy, the early novel, the novel that precedes Endgame. So we could think of this, and the title itself, Fin de Partie or Endgame, it reminds us of chess as a game, right? So the character of Ham is like the king in chess, and all the moves, all the physical movements on the stage are like little blockings that happen on the game of chess. So there's on the board of chess. So there's like a theatricalization of the chessboard. That's another structural principle in the play. Let me talk very briefly about the text in its sort of material, theatrical dimension a little bit before we go to certain parts of the text, and I'll make a series of reflections on it, and we could end like that. So I wanted to draw your attention to these books, which are part of a series. So the Beckett Digital Manuscript Project has been at work for a long time, and one by one, of course, there's a digital archive, but other than that, we are, they're continuously coming up with these editorial monographs, which are about the making of each of these texts. And this is the Endgame version. Now, there are many things to talk about. Of course, I won't be able to do justice to it. But very briefly, it's interesting how Beckett changes a lot of things from the French to the English. Like there's a song that Clove sings, Beckett simply omits that from the English text. There's a lot of reference to the Bible, as I said, which are clipped out of the French text, and they become much more minimalistic in the English text. There's also more detailing about a boy, a small boy, Clove encounters. If you've read the play, you would know this. Towards the end of the play, Clove sees a boy outside. And again, as I said, it's a Noah's Ark-like situation. So we have two windows, two high windows, one of which shows the earth, the other shows the sea. So this place, this bare interior, almost like a refugee camp, as it were, and the gray light is important. Gray is, of course, a mixture of white and black. So there's an intermediary there, or it's an intermediate color in that sense. And gray is the color that is often mentioned in accounts of war as the color that pervades the atmosphere after a bomb is triggered. Apparently, after the atom bomb was, after it went off, the kind of color it suffused the atmosphere with was gray. So again, there is an evocation of or a very muted evocation of the context of war in that color. Dhushar born. Tar sange atom bomber ekta সম্পর্ক আছে. So, as I said, there are more details in the French text about that small boy Clove encounters when he uses his telescope to, look at the world outside. He's ordered to do so by Ham. Ham cannot see, and Ham is like a boss man, a master, who's always using the resources of this slave character, Clove. There are more details about this little boy who might come into the shelter and might become another version of Clove. These details are omitted, and it's left much more vague and enigmatic in the English text. So there are many such changes. I cannot even begin to talk about all of them. There are also changes from the UK to the US edition, primarily referential changes from the French to the English as well. Famously, there's a prayer scene in Waiting for Godot, in Endgame, and there's that line about God, which goes, "That bastard, he doesn't exist." This particular sentence created a lot of fury, and there's a hilarious set of exchanges. When this play was attempted in London for the first time in Royal Court, the Lord Chamberlain's censorship acts fell on this particular line. They said, you cannot have this line. And Beckett said, I wouldn't remove it. And then he said, and there are these hilarious letters where he makes continuous puns on, Chamberlain. So he would say that chamber pot is back at it and all those things. He said, I can maximum change it to swine and not bastard, but I will not clip the line and it will still be that bastard or that swine. He doesn't exist. So nevertheless, there were all these, censorship issues which the play had to sort of deal with. I won't go further into the patterns of revision and the changes from the French to the English because it will really take us far afield. I do want to briefly mention 2 or 3 things about the theatrical notebook. So in his late life, when Beckett would direct his own plays, he did 2 very important directed versions, self-directed versions of Endgame, one in Germany and the other in England. One in London, the other in, I think, the Schiller Theatre in Berlin. There are 2 theatrical notebooks, 2 very important theatrical notebooks. That and the revised text of Endgame, it's all part of these theatrical notebooks that have now come out in paperback. And they're very soon going to get translated in all the major European languages. So we should be in for some very exciting new productions in Beckett studies, when it comes to the production of the plays. Let me just make one point, and here I would like to share my screen to show you 3 images. So just bear with me a little bit. Let me see. This format seems to be slightly different in Google Meet, but let me see if I can share my screen.
Arkoda, just use the present now thing.
Right.
Can you see that?
Let me check. Yes, present now. Sure. Yeah, I've used Google Meet in the past, but this I think might be a new version. So it has a slightly more advanced interface.
Yeah, just like Beckettian text technology is always in flux.
But Devarito, can you confirm if you can see?
Yeah, sure. I will. I think it's coming. Okay, let me unpin you for the moment and pin the presentation.
Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah, I have pinned the presentation, so it's visible to everyone.
Okay. So you can see the drawings here, right? Okay, perfect. Thank you. So this is again from the theatrical notebooks, and I just wanted to draw your attention to his obsessional direction here, and it's there all across his works, not just in Endgame. He was almost, he almost thought of the texts as choreography. In fact, this has to be taken seriously. Beckett was a very musical director. He played the piano, by the way. He was an excellent pianist. And he had a very profound sense of musicality. In fact, he would always say, do not do my plays like realism. Do it musicologically. Do it physiologically. So his plays are almost like dance drama, even when they are not. Of course, there are plays which are much more choreographic, like, for example, the late play Quad. But almost every play of his has this choreographic dimension. So what you can see here is a page. I hope the picture I clicked is clear enough. So there are 2 patterns.
Yes, right. It's clear enough.
Okay, thank you. There are 2 patterns, as you can see here. There are 2 little drawings, and this Beckett is doing to show how a particular walk will happen. And these are all points where certain lines are supposed to be spoken. So you can understand the precision of his direction. For every sentence in Endgame, he has a particular blocking, what in theater is called blocking. অর্থাৎ প্রত্যেকটা বাক্য একটা বিশেষ মঞ্চাবস্থান বা মঞ্চে একটা বিশেষ অবস্থান থেকেই একমাত্র বলা সম্ভব। এরকম একটা নোশন বেকেটের theatrical notebook গুলোতে সবসময় রয়েছে। এবং as you can see, everything is geometrically represented. So this is from the London notebook where it's less graphic, but this is from the German notebook, the Schiller notebook. And again, if we go back to the Schiller notebook, this is again Beckett doing a sort of a stage drawing and mapping out how the blockings will work. This is a particular moment from the play when it is called the thinking walk of Clove. So Clove is trying to do a walk on stage to show how he's thinking as he's walking. And the physical movement of the walk, in a way, is an embodiment of thinking. বেকেটের ক্ষেত্রে চিন্তা এই প্রক্রিয়াটা ভীষণ শারীরিক একটা প্রক্রিয়া। চিন্তা মানুষ তার গোটা শরীর দিয়ে করে। This is something that we always see in Beckett. এবং যেখানে এই জায়গাটা যেখানে রয়েছে, ক্লোভ অ্যাকচুয়ালি বলছে যে আমি যদি না হাঁটতে পারি তাহলে আমি আর চিন্তাও করতে পারবো। So there's a correlation, as it were, sort of a dependency relation there. So I just wanted to show you this to give you a sense of how, meticulous Beckett was in terms of his direction. And he would sometimes, want this particular, precision to always be there, even when he's not directing his own plays. I mean, he would always want this. Okay, let me just stop sharing now, because I think that's as much as I wanted to do. Yes, Debarito, now if you want to, you can.
I have already changed the settings and I have pinned you on the screen.
Thanks. Okay, so I just wanted to briefly mention that. Let me now take you through certain moments in the text in the next 15-20 minutes. I know we don't have a lot of time, but we can always come back with questions, and if you have questions, we can go over that. Now, what is this play all about? Certain themes. I've already mentioned some of them, like the biblical theme of Genesis, the survival of the species, the theme of the end of the world, the apocalyptic theme. There's a lot of work recently that has happened on Endgame which approaches the play from an ecological perspective. পরিবেশ এবং পরিবেশের যে দৃষ্টিভঙ্গিটা, অর্থাৎ পরিবেশ দূষণ, ক্লাইমেট চেঞ্জের যে ডিসকোর্সটা, সেটা দিয়েও সাম্প্রতিককালে এন্ডগেমকে নানাভাবে পড়া হচ্ছে। It's again the beauty of the Beckettian text that it's contextually so open. You can read it in different ways. You can read it as a political play on the war. You can read it as a play on the refugee crisis in a contemporary contextualization. You can read it as a play about the ecological crisis. Those famous lines, for example, between Ham and Clove, has the nature forgotten us? There's no more nature. There's no more nature, you exaggerate. এই ধরনের এক্সচেঞ্জ গুলোর কথা ভাবা যেতে পারে। And the sort of, almost the end of the world scenario that the play presents. The play, as I see it, is also about this sort of cruelty, this theme of cruelty, the conflict between the father and the son. Ham and Clove are in that master-slave relational dynamic, but they're also like father and son. Clove is like an adopted son of Ham's. And there's a part in the play called the Chronicle, where Ham does his long monologue of a storytelling. What does that storytelling say to us? It tells us, or it gives us, it offers us a backstory of Clove's. So it seems like Clove is quite literally a war child, and his father perished in the war. They were all famished and they didn't have anything to eat, and Ham took him into his service. So Clove is quite literally an adopted war child of Ham's. By the end of the play, there is a return of that waiting for Godot-like logic of recursion. এটা বেকেটের নাটকে আমরা সবসময় দেখি, যে কারণে বলা হয়েছিল ওয়েটিং ফর গডো সম্পর্কে ফেমাসলি যে in the play nothing happens twice. The first act gets differentially repeated in the second act. এবং ওই রকম একটা পুনরাবৃত্তিমূলক সম্পর্ক আছে দুটো অঙ্কের মধ্যে, দুটো অ্যাক্টের মধ্যে। So this is a single act play, but by the end of the play, that sequence I just mentioned about the small boy, it seems like there's some trace of life outside this shelter, and there's a small boy Clove is able to see when he uses his telescope to look at the Earth window. Again, we have to depend on Clove. Is Clove telling the truth? There's no way of verifying that. But as Ham says, if this boy lives, he might come into the shelter, and he might become Clove 2.0. He might become yet another Clove. In that way, the entire play continues. As the title, the chess metaphor in the title suggests, it's about the end game turn in the game of chess. But what does that mean? The irony of this, the Eliotesque irony of this, is that in the end is the beginning. So there is a sort of a beginning implicit in the end itself. And that means at the end of the play, we can possibly go back to the beginning of the play, and the entire play can restart. This is the sense we get at the end of Waiting for Godot as well. এবং এই শেষ থেকে আবার শুরু হতে পারে, this sense is very much pervasive in the second play. I mean, in this order of saying it, the second play in Endgame as well. So to go back to the point, another theme of the play that way is recurrence. Recurrence or repetition, or this infinity of repetition. A recursive text which can never come to an end. Like Beckett's like Beckett's favorite Joyce text, Finnegan's Wake. Finnegan's Wake এর শেষ বাক্যটা অসম্পূর্ণ বাক্য, সেটা একভাবে প্রথম বাক্যটাতে ফেরত যায়। ওই বলে যেখানে শুরু হচ্ছে, শেষ হচ্ছে উপন্যাসটা Finnegan's Wake, সেখান থেকেই আবার কিন্তু প্রথম বাক্যটাতে ফেরত চলে যাওয়া যায়। রিভার রান, ওই টা যেটা দিয়ে উপন্যাসটা শেষ হচ্ছে, তারপর থেকে আবার প্রথম বাক্যটাতে ফেরত চলে যাওয়া যায়। River run past Eaves and Adams, from the swerve of shore to the bend of bay, from the commodious vicus of recirculation back to Hoth Castle and its environs. That wonderful opening sentence of Finnegan's Wake. Nevertheless, to come back to Endgame, there's also a lot of contextual work. আমি খুব সংক্ষেপে কিছু major critical focus এর কথা বলার চেষ্টা করছি। Peter Fifield, namok ekjon Beckett scholar, he wrote a very influential article a decade back which opened up some new biographical context. Beckett was a friend of a very important and a very significant French philosopher of his times, Georges Bataille. Georges Bataille's father was terminally ill when Beckett was friends with him, and he would sometimes go and see Bataille. Now, Peter Fifield has claimed in his 2010 article, if I'm not mistaken, that there's a very strong relationship between Bataille's father and the character Ham. He has claimed that Ham is partially modeled on what Beckett saw in terms of this very complex relationship between Bataille and his father. When his father was sick and Bataille had to take care of him, in spite of all the love, there was always this irritation of caretaking, or irritation of, irritation that came from love possibly, but the irritation or coercion which was part of this whole notion of, medically taking care of a family member who's sickening and who's dying possibly. So it's a very easy thing to talk about, but it's not very easy when one has to play that role. And there's a certain kind of bickering that sets in. Now, this bickering is something that we see very strongly in this play. It's also a play about that kind of care, and how care can also inhere a certain dimension of coercion. Nevertheless, I won't develop that point further, but to come back to this ash can, why are the parents in trash bins? It's a very odd, cruel, and a very dark, sinister choice to have the parents, Nell and Nag, in the trash cans. But it's again a very deliberate choice on Beckett's part. It's provocative, it's meant to create an impact, it's also supposed to be laughable. One thing that we need to perhaps highlight, and Adorno did in his text that I mentioned, that this is a play which has to be ultimately taken as a comedy, as a deeply disturbing comedy. Beckett doesn't call it tragicomedy like he did with Waiting for Godot, but it's a tragicomedy. It's a kind of a tragicomedy. There's that famous line in the play that goes, "There's nothing funnier than unhappiness. There's nothing funnier than unhappiness," which in a way sums up the very spirit or the very tone of the play. It's a comedy, even though it has very strong tragic undertones and overtones. To come back to the point of this play being about cruelty, about conflict, and the parents in the trash bin, as it were. So apart from the comic effect, of course, there's a certain understanding here of the trace of the parent as a waste. I'm talking a little bit psychoanalytically here, but I wouldn't go into the details of this because it might get us into too complicated waters. But খুব সহজভাবে একটা জিনিস ভাবা যাক, আমরা কিভাবে সারা জীবন আমাদের বাবা মাদের বহন এবং বাহন করি, ওই রবীন্দ্রনাথের ওই ওয়ার্ড প্লেটা মাথায় রেখে আমরা তাদেরকে একভাবে বহনও করি, একভাবে বাহনও করি, দুটোই করি। অনেক সময় তারা আমাদের ওপরে একটা ওয়েট হয়ে থাকেন, আবার অনেক সময় তারা আমাদের একটা চালিকা শক্তি হয়েও থাকেন। এইখানে খুব প্রভোকেটিভলি হলেও there is this idea of the parent as a waste. This idea of the parent as a waste for the subject. This is communicated quite strongly through the trope of the ash bins, when we have Nell and Nag in the two ash bins. Of course, it's also about the wastefulness of the entire world coming to an end and the kind of apocalyptic setting we have in Endgame. Let me talk very briefly about some of the difficult elliptical lines in the play. So the play begins with a mime, by the way, which is often neglected, but we should keep that in mind. This is what Beckett calls the inspection and the unveiling in the theatrical notebooks and in the drafts. We have Clove coming into the text, coming onto the stage. Everything is wrapped, everything is under the wraps, and he slowly unveils the ash cans. He unveils Ham on his wheelchair-like, position. It's not exactly a wheelchair, but he's on something like a wheelchair. So again, he unveils everything. He has this whole ladder routine. With a ladder, he goes to both the high windows, the earth window and the sea window, and inspects. These are called inspections and unveiling, and Beckett largely simplified these actions, these physical mime actions. It's interesting, each time Clove unveils these objects on stage, Ham, the trash can that has Nell, the trash can that has Nag, the two windows, each time he looks outside, the text says, this is a very important stage direction, that Clove is supposed to do a brief laugh, a brief mechanical laugh. So from the very beginning, we have these Chaplin-esque routines with the ladders and so on. Of course, you'd be reminded of Chaplin's films, and this was a conscious reference point for Beckett. So he would, Clove would move around, inspect everything, unveil them with a certain degree of comicality, the brief laugh. There's a tableau here, or a very short still image, and these tableaus are written into the play later. They were not there in the French play. In the English text, Beckett sort of imported them. Nevertheless, the very first sentences of the play are given to Clove, and Clove goes, "Finished, it's finished, nearly finished, it must be nearly finished. Grain upon grain, one by one, and one day, suddenly, there's a heap, a little heap, that impossible heap." This is a very important line because it refers to Zenos Paradox. Zenos Paradox of the Millet seeds. Zeno was this ancient Greek Stoic philosopher, and there are many paradoxes with Zeno. One of the more important paradoxes is about the Millet seeds. So we have one seed, and you add a second seed to it, then you add a third seed to it. As long as you're adding them one by one, when does it become a heap? Each seed is singular. So when does it become a collective? This is the paradoxical question Zeno asks. And that's the little heap mentioned here. Later on, Ham will mention it. In fact, he would say, millet seeds, and he would say, as in that old Greek. So Zeno is not mentioned by name, but there's a kind of an oblique allusion to Zeno. Now, this theme is important because this brings us back to the idea of ending, an endlessness of ending. This is the paradox in Beckett. There's an endlessness of ending. So if you look at it from another angle, from that heap, when you take it out, when you take out the millet seeds, how and when do you arrive at the void, at the nothingness, the ending? But then the other side of that question is, when does the singular become a collective? When do these seeds become a heap? So there's the reference to that, and that's how the play begins. Ham is introduced. He has this bloody handkerchief on his face, which he folds. And again, we see that sort of obsession of Beckett's. He would even mention that the handkerchief needs to be folded 4 times into a square and then put it into his back pocket. So every little detail counts for him. And we have this, very interesting sentence early on in Ham's speech: "Can there be misery loftier than mine?" And then this, again, this aphoristic style of saying things: "The bigger a man is, the fuller he is, and the emptier." He's a gloomy character, always trying to speak as if from the pulpit, speaking like a master. Right? অনেকটা আমরা যেরকম ভাবে মাস্টারমশাই হিসেবে ক্লাসে জ্ঞান দিই ওই রকম ভাবে কথা বলে আর কি। Ham is like a bit of a parody of the master. We see this in Waiting for Godot with Pozzo as well. That's what Lucky parodies in that famous, tortuous think dance or that speech. The bickering that I was talking about, almost a husband-wife like bickering. In fact, at one point, Beckett said all these pseudo-couples are essentially me and Suzanne. Suzanne was his wife. Have you not had enough? Yes. Of what? Of this thing. I always had, not you. So this kind of bickering. Why do you keep me? There's no one else. There's nowhere else. So all these bickerings, but they have a very strong, ironic sense of humor about them. Let's also keep that in mind. Like, for example, I've made you suffer too much, haven't I? It's not that. What? I haven't made you suffer too much? So there's always an element of wit in this bickering. We should keep that in mind. They're both disgusted with each other. They want to get rid of each other. And yet there's something emotional that seems to bind them at some level, right? At some point, in fact, throughout the play, Ham would say, "Why don't you kill me?" And then, again, we have this very funny response from Clove. He keeps saying, "I don't know the combination of the larder." মানে সোজা কথায় বলতে গেলে যদি আমার কাছে পটাশিয়াম সাইনাইড থাকতো এক্ষুনি দিয়ে দিতাম, কিন্তু নেই, কি করব, এইরকম একটা। Outside of fear, it's death, as I said. They keep cussing at each other. They keep going at each other. Every man is specialty. Again, a very typical Ham-like aphorism. এইরকম জ্ঞান বাক্য যাকে বলে, আপ্ত বাক্য, aphorism কথাটা যদি বাংলা করতে হয়। যেটা বলছিলাম about that ecological theme, nature has forgotten us. There's no more nature. No more nature. You exaggerate. We breathe. We change. We lose our hair, our teeth, our bloom, our ideals. So again, you have that sort of ironic, political undertone. To lose the teeth and to lose the ideal, they're not the same thing, of course. To lose our political, idealism, as it were. There are little references to the Bible that survive in the final text, like Ham's sentence when he's again sort of abusing Clove and saying, "What do you see on the walls of your kitchen? Many, many naked bodies." So mene, mene, this is a reference to the famous scene in the Bible, mene, mene, tekel, ufar sin, where God writes something on the wall with their own hands, as it were. So there are these little surviving scenes, as it were, traces from the Bible. I'll not take more than 10 minutes. I know we are a little bit, above, the time limit, but I hope that's all right.
Not to worry.
I'll just take 10 more minutes to go through some of the more difficult textual sections which might help the students. Throughout the play, there is this line that keeps getting repeated: something is taking its course. Again, we don't know what it is. It's an enigmatic event that seems to be happening. The end of the world itself, maybe the war, maybe the bombardment. There were bombardments, of course, in France, in the vicinity, and Beckett, as I said, was working in French resistance. He was in a resistance cell called Gloria, and he saw the war from very close quarters. In fact, in a sense, he was part of the war, possibly. I mean, in one sense, at least, or the part of the resistance work. By the way, another essay that I would like to mention, if you can get your hands on it, that will be great.